to the Socialist Register panel on the question of strategy after Occupy. My name is Vivek Chibber. I'm a co-editor with Leo Panich and Greg Albo of the Socialist Register. The subject of this panel flows from the theme of this year's volume of the Register, which will be here towards the end of the panel. Monthly Review is going to bring copies of the volume, which you can look at and hopefully purchase. The theme of that volume was the question of strategy. And when we were planning the volume, of course, initially we planned it years ago, which was before any of us could have ever dreamt that an explosion such as the one we witnessed with Occupy across the country was really on the cards at all. And we thought of ourselves as actually having had enormously good luck and a sense of timing, that just when the volume was about to come out, we saw one of the most promising and most exciting social mobilizations of the left in this country in a very, very long time. The memory of Occupy is still with us, and it still inspires us. But what it also brings up, I think, more clearly than anything else, is that while the movement drew upon and excited the passions and the frustrations of so much of this country against the American ruling class, against the corporate takeover of literally every aspect of our lives, against the atomization that all of us have seen and experienced of the defeats of the left, the brutal onslaught coming from both political parties. At the same time, it showed how weak we are without any kind of party, without any kind of organizational structures for these movements to go into, and how bereft we are of a sense of strategy. And we have to be honest about this. We are all floundering in this regard. We're all thinking about both how to capture the energies of the American working class, of working people, and then once captured them, what we do with them. And I think it's foolhardy to think we have the answers to this. The difficulty we faced with this volume of the Register was precisely that we found ourselves as a group of socialists, organizers, some intellectuals, thinking about strategy at a time when we don't have any real social or political weight as a left. And the difficulty of posing to ourselves questions that are concrete enough, that are determinate enough to allow for concrete and determinate answers. Well, that challenge notwithstanding, we forged ahead. And I think the volume, given our limitations, has been a successful one. It's doing well. People have responded very well to it. And hopefully, with today's panel, with 4 of the illustrious contributors to the volume, we can get a very productive and good discussion going on these issues. Let me now move quickly to introducing our speakers, and I'll say a little bit about what the format will be after I've introduced them, and then we will proceed to the presentations. We will begin with Barbara Epstein, who is a professor in the History of Consciousness program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. That, for those of you who are New Yorkers, that's west of New Jersey. Following her will be Sam Gindin, who is a long-time figure in the Canadian labor movement, a one-time Packard chair in political science at York University in Toronto, was one of the research analysts for the Canadian auto workers for the longest time. To his left is Michael Spourdalakis, who's professor of political science at Athens University in Greece, and one of the founding members and in the strategic committee, I think, of Syriza, one of the most important and dynamic left formations now in the Western world, I think. And finally, we have Charlie Post. He's a member of Solidarity and teaches sociology at Borough of Manhattan Community College and is a shop steward in the PSC, which is the Professional Staff Council, that is the union for the faculty in City University of New York. These are our 4 speakers. They will all speak on drawing on the papers that they wrote for the 2013 Socialist Register on the issue of strategy. They will speak for 15 to 18 minutes each. I will be strict about that. Once they are done, we will have a discussion. And let me just say, the discussion, as most of you are veterans of Left Forum, you know, will keep to the convention, which is try not to speechify. Try to keep your comments short, and if at all possible, make them into questions and not just observations. But we'll revisit this issue when the discussion starts. We will start now with Barbara Epstein, who will speak on Occupy in Oakland, I think.
Well, it's Oakland and Occupy Wall Street, actually. Though I'm going to depart from that and talk about the movement in general. First I want to say that both my article and what I'm going to say here rests on, I did interviews, I participated in Occupy Oakland in a sort of subsidiary way. I also did a series of interviews with participants in Occupy Oakland, a series of interviews with participants in Occupy Wall Street. That was the basis for my article in Socialist Review, and then I subsequently, Socialist Register, I'm sorry.
Bring those in the front row so we can correct anything.
Yes.
I want to start a fist fight.
Yes. And then I also did a series of interviews with people in the broader anarchist-oriented movement, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about. My article in Socialist Register focuses on the question of violence. In particular, what I was looking at was the difference between Occupy Wall Street, which blended a defiant stance with a commitment to the principles of nonviolence, and Occupy Oakland, which what I argue is they both started off in the same way. Because of their message and because of the police violence directed against peaceful protesters, there was a huge amount of public support for both movements. And I argued that Occupy Wall Street was able to very effectively sustain and develop that public support by its combination of a defiant style and its ability to mix that with a commitment to the principles of nonviolence. Whereas, and what Occupy Wall Street did was to avoid making the question of the police and police violence the focus of the movement. It kept the focus very clearly on the message, which was, as we all know, the rapidly increasing gap between the power and wealth of those at the top and everybody else. And in Occupy Wall Street, the question of police violence became central, and there was never a commitment to nonviolence, and instead, it wasn't as if there was a lot of violence. The violence was actually very minimal. It amounted to a few broken windows and some fires set in garbage cans, and a few other things along those lines. But nevertheless, there was a tone of provocation that got in the way of public support. And with the diminution of public support, morale inside the movement also began to diminish. Now, I now think, looking back on it, that while this was true, and I think it was an important argument, I missed the main point. And the main point was that what brought both Occupy Oakland and Occupy Wall Street to an end was the same thing that brought the whole movement to an end, which was the focus on a tactic that turned out to be unsustainable. Because eventually, as could have been predicted, all of the Occupy movements were closed down. And the problem was that the movement had not thought about that previously. There was no discussion of what to do after that happened or how to develop the movement further. And this was partly because the identity of the movement, both in Oakland and in New York and elsewhere, had come to focus on the tactic and on the organizational style of the movement. Now, this is what leads me to place the Occupy movement as the third phase in the development of what I would call a post-60s evolution of an anarchist-oriented form of activism, of youth activism. The reason, by the way, there was a major, in fact, anarchist streak in the movements of the 60s, but because it didn't call itself anarchist, and because I don't think there were as clear connections between that movement and what evolved later, I'm leaving that aside. And instead, what I want to talk about is how an anarchist-oriented style of youth activism developed essentially from the late 1970s on. And the reason I'm doing this is because what you see, if you look at this, is on the one hand that something that was a current, only one current in a larger radical movement in the 1970s and early 80s has steadily broadened to the point where I would say it is the dominant perspective among young radical activists. So that is point number one, that what we're looking at is not something that is minor. This is an approach to radical activism that is now the dominant approach among young activists in the United States, and I understand in Canada too, though I don't know nearly as much about that. And the second point I would make is I would say that the same problems have plagued each phase of this movement. And this has to do with the question of strategy and the absence of strategy. It also has to do with questions of organization. In my account, the first phase of this evolving anarchist-oriented movement, and by the way, the reason I say anarchist-oriented is because not everybody in it identifies as an anarchist. But I would say that is the dominant position. First phase was the direct action movement of the late 1970s, early 1980s, meaning the direct action wing of the movement, first against nuclear power and then against nuclear arms. That was a movement that combined anarchism, feminism, environmentalism, and a commitment to nonviolence, and that also developed a consensus decision-making process, which led to an intense sense of community in its actions. That movement, particularly the anti-nuclear phase of that movement, the anti-nuclear arms phase of that movement, began to go into decline when it became clear that that tactic, namely the tactic of mass civil disobedience actions, was not in itself going to bring an end to the arms race or to nuclear arms. That we had organized as many people as could be convinced to participate in such actions, and that that movement itself was not going to bring about that end. But with the end of that movement, that style, in particular consensus process, and that style of anarchism, closely linked to feminism and environmentalism, took hold more broadly. And then I would say that the Seattle demonstrations of 1999 sort of crystallized the second generation of that movement. Now, many of those activists had actually become involved in the movement prior to Seattle, but it was at Seattle that the second phase of this movement took shape. And again, that had to do with a demonstration at which there were police attacks on peaceful protesters, that the radical demonstration, which was part of the broader Seattle protest, also became kind of a radical festival, and that became a model for many activists for a style that they wanted to replicate. Now, the other thing about the Seattle protest is that that's where the link between anarchism and nonviolence was cut. There was a debate at that demonstration. The Black Bloc appeared. They threw stones through the windows of corporate chain stores. There were some activists who either tried to stop them or tried to point them out to the police. There was a debate after that within the movement about this, and the defenders of nonviolence decisively lost that debate, and nonviolence was replaced by the idea of the diversity of tactics. Anyway, that was the second phase of this movement, and it was a broader phase of the movement than the earlier one. There were more people involved in it. It was covered more parts of the country. Occupy, I see as the third phase of this movement. Again, it was anarchists and young activists oriented towards anarchism who were at the center of the movement. This was most clearly, I would say, the variety of anarchism that David Graeber calls small a anarchism, which means anarchists who participate in broader movements, either as affinity groups or as individuals, but they don't belong to organizations. They are committed to horizontality, decentralization, both in their conception of a future society, but also in their present political action. I think what's striking about this movement is that the form of anarchism that is that's at the center of it is in some ways different than classical anarchism. I see classical anarchism as primarily organized around a rejection of the state. I would say that this form of anarchism is that what's primary for this form of anarchism is the rejection of various forms of oppression. The rejection of racism, sexism, homophobia, and for a majority of the activists, capitalism, class oppression. There's also enormous suspicion of the state and unwillingness to participate in it, but in my experience, the issue of the state and also the issue of leadership inside the movement is more open to debate, whereas the question of these opposition to these forms, absolute opposition to these forms of oppression, is not debatable within the movement. The Occupy movement repeated the problem of the previous two phases of the same movement, namely that the tactic and the form of organization, again, consensus process, though elaborated, became the identity of the movement. And when it turned out that the tactic was not sustainable, the movement began to dissolve. That didn't happen immediately, but it was clear once people were driven out of the spaces that they occupied that holding the movement together was, in the long run, a losing proposition. This is what we've got with both its strengths and its weaknesses. And I would say that the strengths are, first of all, that the outlook that I've described, which places these various forms of oppression at the center, also incorporates a great deal of suspicion of the state, touches the political sensibility of a large sector of a generation, and therefore it attracts people very widely. It also has a utopian view of the future, which I think much of the rest of the left has lost. And it has and I'm not using the word utopian critically, I'm using it in a positive sense. And it also grounds its present political action in the same utopian vision and set of principles. It maintains the high moral ground, and it, in comparison with the rest of us, has relatively little to apologize for. It does not have the baggage of, for instance, the communist movement, which I come out of, and the problem of dealing with the legacy of Soviet Stalinism. It doesn't have the problem of social democracy with its legacy of compromise to the point of acquiescence. And even the Trotskyist legacy has the problem of sectarianism, splits, and at times disruptive behavior within the left. So this is a movement that doesn't have to apologize for really any of the major problems of the left in the past. The problem is that it also has serious weaknesses, and weakness number one, of course, is that it has no strategy. And beyond having no strategy, I would say that it has no vocabulary for talking about strategy. And therefore it comes to define itself in terms of its tactic and its form of organization, both of which are also utopian in the negative sense in that they can't be sustained. So, therefore, it becomes a kind of flash movement. It becomes a movement of very promising mobilizations, which then evaporate. The other thing which I think goes along with this is that it tends to be purist, and because there is so much focus on its form of organization, it has great difficulty forming alliances with other movements and organizations that have different styles. Having criticized my article, I'll also criticize this talk, which is I don't think that criticisms of this sort are going to have any impact on this movement. I think this movement is what it is, and it's going to go on being what it is, and we probably are going to have more flash movements like this. And the real question is, can we build a movement that addresses some of these gaps? That has, instead of having a purist and utopian vision of what political action consists of, is able to build alliances, is able to incorporate various sectors of the population and various movements despite their different degrees of adherence to, I don't think socialists would be the majority in such a movement. I think we have to have a broad coalition, and I think we have to have a clear conception of organization and some clear sense of mission that can be the basis for strategy. I think if we had a movement like that, that could provide, so to speak, the framework that would contain the kinds of flash movements of a sort of radical utopian sort that I think we are going to continue to see. And if I can just add one more thing, my impression of the second generation is that many of them are critical of the very same things that I'm critical of. They don't have a solution. But many of them cease to call themselves anarchists and instead use the term anti-authoritarian, partly out of their increasingly critical view of the form taken by the anarchist movement.
There's a lot of
We have
floor
people
here.
standing
People
outside.
want to sit on the
Yeah.
floor. There's a lot of space on the floor here.
Okay, our next speaker will be Sam Ginden from Toronto and York University, Canadian Auto Workers, Toronto Workers' Assembly, etc.
Thanks, Vivek. So, I'm gonna speak very much about workers and organizing. But let me just start with the question of Occupy. It seems that there are three parts of what was so impressive about Occupy in terms of its tactics was how audacious it was, and how audacious it was at different levels that I think were necessary to get out there. One was the audaciousness of action, actually doing something when nothing much was going on. One was the audaciousness of having a slogan that actually addressed class, even if it was in crude terms. And one was the audaciousness of not having a policy program, and then by implication saying it's the system that sucks. It's not any specific part of it. So I think those were all positive. There were three indirect things that came out of Occupy that I think were at least as important. One was that it actually showed that this kind of tactic isn't a strategy, as Barbara was emphasizing, that theater can't change society, that even protests aren't strategies, and that we needed a new politics beyond horizontalism. I think that's one of the things that came out of this. And I agree with Barbara. I don't expect that Occupy as a movement will reach that conclusion, but the question is, will individuals within Occupy, reflecting on what happened, move on? And that raises further questions about the left. The second indirect thing that came out of Occupy was that Occupy was an invitation to unions to do something, to actually occupy something. Occupy was something that industrial unions came out of in the 30s, and the unions didn't pick up that challenge. a part of this was that Occupy didn't have that kind of relationship to unions, and wasn't particularly interested until Occupy happened. But it really tells us something about where unions are at. The union that I came out of, auto workers, were facing a plant closure at Caterpillar at the time. And in the past, we had actually taken over Caterpillar a different time when there was a plant closure. This time, there was no consideration of taking it over. This time, the response to Occupy was, we'll go down there and show them that we support them. And you send down a couple of people and maybe you give them some money. What really had to happen was workers had to start occupying things. That's what would have made Occupy into something, and not just factories, but social services, government buildings, etc. The third indirect thing that Occupy exposed was our weakness. Our inability to influence this, to develop it, and now, I guess, still an open question, but the question of whether we're actually recruiting any people who came out of Occupy and are learning things. I want to concentrate on the question of unions, although it's completely related to the question of the left. And what I argue in the article is that the problem with unions isn't bureaucracy, and it isn't that they don't respect movements and that they're not interested in coalitions. The problem is much more fundamental. And the problem is that unions are, at their core, sectional organizations. That they represent a specific group of workers who happen to work together, whatever their politics are. And it's not that they're not revolutionary, it's that they can't even defend people right now with that kind of structure. Now, the point about that structure was that there was a moment in history through the 50s and 60s where that kind of structure could achieve things for workers themselves, just fighting for themselves. You could make gains, and you could even spread them. And that the significance of this moment in time is that that moment is over. That the ability to win things simply by taking care of your own members, you just can't do it anymore. And that raises this question of alternative forms of working class organization to intersect with unions if unions are going to change. Now, the second thing that I argue, and I'm just going to state it, is that there's no internal dynamic within unions to transform this. There can be rebellions, as there have been, but they can't be sustained. That the members are too fragmented, they don't have the resources, they're too localized on their own, and that the leaders either are themselves overwhelmed, or they're actually comfortable with this. That it actually isn't such a bad thing to tell your members, I'm sorry, you got to lower your expectations. Globalization, neoliberalism, Obama's betrayal, there's nothing much we can do about it. It's a much more comfortable life. So if unions can't, if there's no internal dynamic for transformation, this raises the question of where might it come from? And the answer to that question has always been, from some kind of a left or a party. But the dilemma is that the left is at least as weak as the unions are. That's the reality of what we have to face. So this is the historical moment that we're confronted. In terms of what can be done about it, there's two kinds of questions that I think are important, and Vivek raised them both in his introduction. One is, well, even if we had some kind of an organization that could intervene, what would it do? And the second question is, what would an organization look like if a party isn't on the agenda and you can't just wish it into being? So let me start with the first question. The reason that there are opportunities out there in terms of the unions is that not only are they being attacked, and not only is there a vacuum in terms of the institution being able to respond to that attack and the leadership being able to respond to that attack, but the nature of the solutions that we face right now are polarized. It's actually only radical solutions that can meaningfully do something for workers today. And those things in combination create some space for the left to intervene. The left is relevant in a way that I think it hasn't been before. The second thing is that for workers in the public sector, they will inevitably be isolated if they demand higher wages in this context, in the context of austerity, because it's seen by the rest of workers as either meaning less services, there's only so much in the budget, or more taxes for them personally. And this is a dilemma that has to be addressed. And the only way to address this for the public sector workers is actually to emphasize, to see it in class terms. To see their role as playing a leading role in the defense of services and the expansion of new kinds of services for the working class as a whole. If they don't do that, they just have nowhere to go. It's just, a slower road to hell, even if they're fighting back. Now, once you raise that question, it also raises questions about the structure of unions. It's not just a policy change. It's not about putting up a billboard or passing another resolution that says we love social services. It actually means demonstrating to a cynical public and cynical workers that you're committed to this. And what commitment means is, it begins with, if you're really committed to this, you'd have to change everything about your organization. What you put resources into, what you research, how you train your staff, what your staff do, what your members do, how you relate to your members, how you relate to the community. But even more profound than that, it actually means you have to rethink what you do in collective bargaining. It means that at this moment in time, you actually have to think about, in order to rebuild a base so that we can do things, we have to put social services on the bargaining table, not just our own demands, and not just as an add-on, as a priority. And once you do that, you have to also confront the question of, well, what are your tactics going to be? If you're saying that our main role in life is to defend social services, how do you justify that when you go on strike? Now, it may be that you have to go on strike anyways because of certain circumstances, and you have to prepare for that by at least showing that you're reluctant to take away the services, but it also means that you have to creatively think about, well, what kind of tactics would work so that we emphasize the class dimensions of this rather than we're just taking away your service. And there's examples of workers, when confronted with having to think about that, are amazingly creative. One idea that came up in the hospital sector, doesn't look like they're doing it right now because I think they'll feel that them doing it alone would isolate them because there isn't much of a fight going on. But the idea is interesting, was to have a work-in. Rather than go on strike and not get paid, why not get paid, but go into work and bring people from another shift in so you actually have more people working. And what you're demonstrating is the kind of services you could provide. This is the long-term care sector. The kind of services you could provide if you were serious about providing good services and challenging management in terms of what would it do? Would it keep you out? Would it let you in? And it also raises questions about, if you do this, you actually have to organize work if you're doing this during the strike. And if you're organizing work, it raises questions about the role of workers in beginning to think about transforming the state, because this is in the public sector. How would the state operate differently? Other examples have been postal workers being on strike but delivering pension checks and welfare checks. When the government prevented them from doing that and set up a warehouse to deliver the checks, they expected the postal workers to pick at the warehouse. Instead, the postal workers came down with lawn chairs for the people waiting in line, and coffee and donuts, and said, we'd love to deliver this at home, but the state won't let us do it. Government won't let us do it. So workers have always thought, and there's a lot of other examples which I won't get into, but workers confronted with, well, what would you do? Understand their workplace enough that they can think about that. The other question is that in the private sector, the fundamental question for workers in the private sector, especially now, is how do I keep my job? If they're in any unionized sector, if they're in any sector with power. And the problem is that that's not what unions are about. Unions are about selling your labor. And so there's this contradiction between the most important thing to workers and what unions actually do. And what that means is that unions have to address the question of jobs. And if they simply address it by narrowly thinking in terms of bargaining, you end up with concessions bargaining. How else can I save my jobs? I'll buy it. You have to go beyond the box that workers are in and the logic of competitiveness, and begin to raise questions about broader strategies for saving jobs. And they can't just be Keynesianism, not just because there's no social base for Keynesian policies. Capitalist class isn't interested in it, but because they won't work in this environment. If you want to do something about jobs, you have to raise questions about actually addressing corporate power. In the auto industry, when there was the crisis, it meant actually talking about the conversion of plants. It meant saying that the answer to this crisis is going to be to build more cars. Plus, building more cars hasn't created jobs anyways. It is to think about what is it that we need, what can these incredibly valuable skills and capacities be converted to, And how could you actually have a plan that said something like, if the environment is the most important question for the rest of the century, what would it actually mean to begin retaining these facilities and start talking about democratic planning instead of competitiveness and solidarity, and talking about use instead of profits. It would also mean thinking about something that Leo's written about in the past in terms of job development boards. If we think that part of the role of municipal officials at the local level is to assert that everybody should be going to school, and there's space for them to go to school, why can't we talk about everybody having a right to a job or training to get into a job at the local level, and actually elect local councils whose responsibility is to do that? And that in turn also has its own dynamic. It begins to raise questions of where would you get the funds from, and the need to address the power of finance and getting control over finance. The other thing that unions have to do is around the question of organizing. There's no, you can technically find ways to organize new workers, but inevitably those kinds of technical solutions end up making some deal with corporations like SEIU does, which says we won't organize certain things that you don't want organized if you let us into another place. And then it means that you're developing a certain kind of union. You're not asking the question of what are we actually organizing people for? The critical question of organizing is how do we build the working class? That's what we're trying to do. And if you're thinking about it as building the working class, then it opens the door to other strategies. It means that rather than competing with who's going to get the food sector, you can actually say in a community, especially in a fairly unionized community, why don't we organize the food sector? They can't go anywhere. We can't go to China and ship the hamburgers here. Why don't we organize them collectively across unions? And why don't we start servicing them even before we organize them, to demonstrate that we actually are concerned about building the class. Even if they don't stay in that sector and move on, they will remember this. And we can find where we've actually got a mass base to do this. The other thing I just want to raise that we have to think about is the need for time. Workers need time, perfect time, to read and think and to participate. If we don't figure out how to deal with this time, it's hard to imagine people being active and actually being able to make change. Okay, I'll come to the last point. The critical question is, what kind of organizational form might we think of? And I don't know the answer. We're just struggling with this. And one of the things that we came up with, and it was inspired by something that Bill Fletcher had raised, was the question of intermediate organizations. If there are limits to movements and unions because they're either sectionalist or because they only focus on a specific identity or specific interest, and if there's a limit in terms of the left having a party, then is it possible to think about an intermediate organization that isn't immediately thinking about state power and transforming the state, but is going beyond sectional interests? And the function of that kind of an organization, and we've been trying to do this in Toronto, is A, to try to develop networks of activists across workplaces, cells of activists across workplaces, so their head is not just into their own workplace, although obviously you have to build in each workplace. Second of all, to be organizing in the community, because class is something that is expressed in the community, and there are all kinds of opportunities to do that around public services, etc. And third, to take on this critical question of education. And education requires massive organizing to actually pull it off, and to start doing education around what capitalism is, and to begin the process of moving towards some kind of a socialist culture. So let me just stop with this and deal with other things in the questions. The problem is not that people are integrated into the system in terms of thinking the system is wonderful. The problem is that people don't think there's an alternative. That is the barrier we face. And that question, answering that question is an organizational question. Because even if they win small battles, which are necessary, the small battles, if they aren't sustained, just demoralize people more. So there's the question of some kind of an organization that can build on small battles, that can actually get across the fact that we're building for the future and struggling in the present. What I haven't talked about is the barriers we ran into in the assembly, and I can do that if we have a question.
next is Michael Sportolakis from Athens University, and it's Syriza.
Okay, thank you, Vivek. What I would like to do tonight, what my contribution would be, it's a bit different because I'm trying to stay on the main theme and the question of our panel from my contribution to the volume you referred to. What I would like to do is to share some thoughts on the question of Occupy from the Greek experience. And I have to say at the outset that the Greek experience is quite different from what I understand from any other experience of the Occupy in the West. For one, it's the movement took place in the midst of the most aggressive austerity program that we've seen for the longest time. Maybe it's a unique. Number two, major difference is that in Greece we did have a left in the sense of having a party or parties of the left, and that's very important and what happened. And number three is something which is a Greek trade, if you like. It's part of the Greek radical tradition, and even not radical tradition. Occupying and initiatives, sittings, are in the very top list of collective action in Greece. And we do use this more, a lot more. Maybe we overuse it in this country in Greece a lot more than the French use the building roadblocks. Okay, so two different traditions. Right? We occupy universities, and it's used in a class way, working class initiatives. They occupy the bosses' offices and claim this, but also doctors sometimes they occupy governmental departments and hospitals and or what have you, quite often. So these three things are quite different, and because of the overuse of this repertoire of action, whoever takes this initiative has to defend it and has to legitimize it vis-a-vis the conservatism of the sort of mainstream citizen, okay? And that's very important. Having said this, and if one wanted to go and answer or address the question of strategy after the Occupy, the Greek experience says to me one has to address the question what happened before, what happened during, and then see what happens after. And what happened before, keeping in mind that Syriza and other smaller leftist formations were there, what happened before the Occupy movement is that Syriza was present in every mobilization, in social forums, in the anti-global movement, and a key turning point was the 2006. There was a major mobilization, including a lot of occupying activities, which aim at against the governmental reforms vis-a-vis the university, sort of trying to privatize sections of the university. And there, the left and the movement achieved a major victory. Forced the government, at the time was the PASOK government, and forced the 80% of the parliamentarians, 8% of the members of parliament agree for the reform. And then the movement forced it to back up on this constitutional proposal. And then it was the uprising in December 2008, and there were several other mobilizations, including environmental issues, locations of even of garbage dumps, where the movement had to be confronted the police and the aggression of the police daily for weeks, basically having street fights for many days and winning at the end. The left, and I mean Syriza here, or primarily Syriza here, ignore the criticism from the media and from the establishment and from the government, and he was actively present in this movement, but not with its own banner. As activists, as part of the broader community collective, they were there, and they didn't have the attitude, or if you like, they didn't have the capacity to control, to manipulate, or patronize this movement. And that's very important. So if one likes to draw a conclusion from this before kind of action, it's you have to be present in the movements, and also you have to achieve certain even small victories to prove that empowering the powerless is very important, and sort of highlight your strategy, which is not pre-described and imposed upon the movement. Now, during the movement, during the Occupy movement, the support was active again, but tacit. And radical left went with the flow of the movement, but didn't lead it somehow. Okay, accepted the rules of the movement, provided institutional, moral, organizational, and legal support where the movement needed that. And also the left, and here comes the party of the left, provided a way out, provided an alternative, provided a prospect, and that was the proposal for the election. Okay, and that was when this thing happened a couple of summers ago. Now, some characteristics, some traits of the movement. The Occupy movement in Greece was militant, and it was class-based, primarily class-based. It was followed or supplemented, if you like, by 28-1 in the period of a year and a half, 28 1 or 2 days general strikes, and they were very successful with demonstrations and what have you. And this movement was resisted not just the destruction of economic and the social fabric of the country, but resisted the drastic undermining of even the basic formalities of the bourgeois democracy in Greece. And again, during the Occupy movement, there were several, I would say, rather major victories. This movement brought down two governments, one, the PASOK government, and then the government of the technocrats. And if it wasn't for that movement, we wouldn't have had last year's election because the government didn't want to have the election. Now, what happened after? Syriza has clearly benefited from the Occupy movement. In fact, it managed to capitalize on it because of its federated and very loose organization, which appeared at the outset to be a disadvantage, eventually became a comparative advantage to be able to express these new forms, new tactics, new technology of mobilization brought back into the party. So, as a modern prince, if you like, Syriza transformed or managed to transform the anger of the people to hope. And he did that by putting forward a fourfold strategy. And this strategy is, as I said, it has 4 moments, if you like, or four dimensions in a very closely dialectically related to one another. One is active present in the field, in the social field, in the way I just described. Number 2, it was an unconventional, non-conformist presence of Syriza's representatives coming from the institutions of social or political representation. There were Syriza's MPs in the Syntagma Square fighting against the police, against the tear gas, etc. Syriza put a program together, but based on the movements and not just on the experts. And the point number 4 of this strategy or moment it was the call of the unity of the left and call to form a left government. This way seems to me, I would dare to say that Syriza not only capitalized on the experience of the Occupy movement, but almost simulated the practices of that movement in its strategy and in its practice after in the last couple of years and after the end of that movement. The opponents, for example, of the local of Syriza more or less imitate the habits developed during the occupied movement. Okay? Even in the proposed constitution for next month's founding conference of the party has some dimensions of that movement. One can detect points and proposals of that. Now, many people say that this movement is dead, it's gone, and there is a recession in the social mobilization and the resistance movement in Greece, and so on and so forth. And this is only partially true. Of course, the people are scared, the people are unemployed, the media attack is beyond imagination, and so on and so forth. But the people who are quite disappointed and say that this movement has vanished, they overlook the fact that a good part of the political energy of this movement has been turned into a huge network of solidarity fighting against austerity. 2,500 separate initiatives of solidarity units and movements throughout the country, which of course are not enough to respond to the social and the human catastrophe in Greece, are operating, and Syriza, again tacitly, nevertheless, quite clearly, by giving 20% of the salaries of its MPs, supports these initiatives. So the before and the during determines the afterlife, if you like, of the Occupy movement, its effectiveness. It's very important to keep in mind that not just the Occupy movement, but all movements who have a sense of even small or larger victory. And it's very important to have a political organization which will determine and materialize the gains and the imagination of this Occupy movement. And that's the Greek experience, and thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Charlie Post of Solidarity and Manhattan Community College.
Okay, the talk I'm going to give, which is based on the essay I have in this volume, The Register, was an attempt to place the most sort of developed and most promising forms of political organization of the left, particularly in Europe, in some sort of historical perspective. And in the essay, which is sort of the title, What's Left of Leninism, I try to provide a historical framework for analyzing the emergence of new left parties in Europe in the last 20 years, focusing on what were the most promising mass organizations that had emerged in Europe at that time. When I started the article, so it didn't include Syriza, it focused on the Italian Communist Party of Refoundation, the PRC, and on Dalinka, the left social democratic formation there. And what I tried to do is test, by looking historically at the history of the socialist left and of the strategic issues that had embroiled it for most of the last century, to assess whether or not these parties, as many of them claimed, were actually both post-social democratic and post-Leninist. And I start off, and I'm going to be very, very abbreviated in terms of the historical material I present in more detail in the essay, is that I start by looking at what the world of the pre-1914 social democracy was about, of the first emergence of class-based workers' parties in the advanced capitalist countries. And I basically argued there that the social democratic parties and unions and mass organizations were the product of three massive waves of working class struggles, predominantly at the workplace, during the economic expansion that had preceded the First World War. Strike waves in the 1890s, 1904 to 1907, and 1912 to 1914. These create, out of small socialist sects and small unions, mostly of industrial workers, create in several countries mass working class parties, mass industrial unions. And these also brought together within these social democratic parties two very distinct social and political trends. On the one hand, these struggles created hundreds of thousands of workplace, community, social, what we would today call social movement leaders. People who carried on and attempted to carry on organizing and struggle between the great battles, between the big strike waves. What were called alternatively back then the militant minority, the working class, or the actual workers' vanguard, not the title of a sect paper. And it was these workers in the 1890s, early 1900s, up through the First World War, that were the mass audience for the left wing of social democracy, which, as Lars Lee points out, not only included people like Lenin and Luxemburg, Trotsky, and Gramsci, but also included Karl Kautsky up through 1912, 1913. It also, these strike waves and the stabilization of parliamentary institutions in most of Europe outside of Russia, the spread of suffrage among working class men, and the legalization of trade unions in most of Europe allowed for the consolidation of a layer of full-time party, parliamentary, and union officials. That this layer then becomes, with the support of the less active members, sections of the working class, the massive social democratic voters, the massive union members, etc., this layer becomes the social basis of reformism within the workers' movement, that they want a place at the table of capitalist society, that they no longer look to transforming society along socialist lines, but instead committed to normalizing class relations through parliamentary reform, through institutionalized collective bargaining, etc. Now, I argue also that each of these great strike waves produced the three great strategic debates in the workers' movement before 1914. Debates that I argue in the later part of the article still, in fact, confront these new left parties. The first debate that came out of the strike wave of the 1890s was the so-called revisionism debate, which is usually portrayed as the question of whether or not capitalism can be piecemeal reformed into socialism, but was really focused on the question of whether or not the parties retained the goal of socialism, replacing capitalism, and very specifically focused on the question of whether or not socialists should participate in governments with liberals. The whole debate was really sparked by the participation of Mitterrand, a French socialist, in a French government in alliance with the so-called Radical Socialist Party. So the question was raised there, and I think it echoes today, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, of when we talk about, these parties talk about a government of the left, does that include what my comrades would call the social liberals, the formal social democratic parties, which are completely committed to austerity, neoliberalism, etc. The second great strike wave, in 1906 to 1908, produces the mass strike debate, which unfortunately we have little access to in English at this point, except for Luxemburg's very important contribution, but which raises some very, very fundamental strategic points that Michael was alluding to. Because that debate was fundamentally about what is the relationship of extra-parliamentary struggle, workplace struggles, political struggles, etc., to the existing socialist parties and the unions. And on the one hand, you see the consolidation from the right wing, the parliamentary politicians, the union bureaucrats, of the notion of the two pillars of social democracy. There is the party that deals with politics, which is defined solely in terms of electoral politics, and you have the unions, which deal with the economic struggle, which is defined solely as the struggle over wages and hours. The two shall not meet. The left wing of social democracy, Luxemburg, Lenin, and others, argued that we have to overcome this, that the role of socialists is to organize politically in all workers' organizations, to contest for leadership the direction of day-to-day struggles with the goal of generalizing these struggles and raising the question of class rule. And finally, there was the debate that came out of the strike wave of 1912-1914 about the imminent war that was going to take place. And the question of what is the attitude of socialists towards their own governments in war and peace. Now, very briefly, I talk about where the Bolsheviks fit into this, and I argue, following Lars Lee, that they were different not because they had a unique theory of the party, they didn't, but because the conditions they faced were very different from the rest of social democracy in the West, that there was no possibility of stable reformism in these countries, in Russia, excuse me. I talk about the split in the socialist movement, the emergence of the communist parties, and the promising emergence of these parties as an independent organization of the militant minority. And how, particularly from 1923 onward, these parties are subjected to the diplomatic maneuvering of the Soviet state and are increasingly deprived of any internal democracy. That much of, and I argue in there, following Lee again, that most of what we call democratic centralism today is something that was invented after the death of Lenin in the Bolshevization campaigns of the mid-1920s. I then trace very brief, and I'm going to be very brief about this, the change in the communist movement, particularly after the Seventh World Congress and the adaptation of the Popular Front strategy. That this marks a huge change not only politically, but sociologically in the communist parties. The communist parties cease being parties, however bureaucratic, however top-down, however at the whims of the Soviet leadership, cease being parties of the militant minority, where revolutionary-minded workers can actually contest with union leaders, reformist social movement leaders, etc., for the direction of social movements, and become instead very much become on the road to becoming social democratic parties like the pre-war social democracy, parties of the union bureaucracy, parties of parliamentary politicians, etc. I talk very briefly, and I'm being very condensed here because I want to talk more about these new parties. I talk about how the disappearance of this militant minority essentially limited all the attempts of the new left in the 60s and 70s to build independent revolutionary organizations, and how the combination of their long-term social democratization and the shift to the right in social democracy by the late 80s, early 90s creates the conditions for the emergence of, in some countries, substantive splits of the existing working class parties, which attempt to rebuild some sort of class politics. And there, again, I focus mostly on what were at that point the two most important. Die Linke in Germany, which represented not only a recomposition of the old Stalinist ruling party in the East, but a significant break of trade union officials and trade union activists out of the German Social Democratic Party, which had become increasingly neoliberal, and the break of Refoundation, which took, again, a substantial number of working class militants, trade union officials, social movement activists, out of the Communist Party that was becoming, in fact, not just the Social Liberal Party, but wanted to become the Democratic Party in Italy. And I spent a good deal of time talking about how each of these parties, while claiming to be both post-Leninist and post-social democratic, face again the questions that convulsed the pre-war socialist movement. The question of reform and revolution, and in particular the question of not simply programmatically are we anti-capitalist or anti-neoliberal, but more importantly the question of participation in government. Both the PCR at a national level, the question of whether they would support center-left governments in parliament that were in fact implementing neoliberal programs and neoliberal austerity, which many people on the Italian far left argued that their participation in these coalitions discredited them and led to their sharp electoral decline. In Germany, Die Linke hasn't faced this at a national level, but has faced this at the level of several states. Whether or not they form coalition governments with the Social Democrats, with the Greens, who are committed to social liberalism, to austerity, etc. The question of war and peace is very much involved in this for the PRC, and the question of whether or not they would continue to be in the leadership of an anti-war movement, or whether they ended up voting for keeping Italian troops in Afghanistan. And then fundamentally there is this question, and I would hope in the discussion Michael can talk more about this, about how Syriza is doing this, of the relationship of these new left parties to the unions and social movements. The PRC in its first years attempted to organize rank-and-file workers in the existing Italian unions into oppositions to the increasingly conservative union leaders. Much of that, as the PRC conservatizes in terms of its relationship to the center-left governments, goes by the wayside. Die Linke never, while individual members are active in the social movements, in unions, etc., as a political organization, they don't have a profile, a political direction, etc. And thus, for me, the future of these new left parties, whether Syriza or other parties, these parties remain anti-neoliberal, anti-capitalist, or whether they follow the social democratic and former communist parties into supporting austerity, are going to depend on two key things. The first, which is I think what Michael emphasized, is the outcome of mass anti-austerity struggles. The sort of victories he described in pushing back particular aspects of the austerity agenda strengthen anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal elements within these parties, while defeats only strengthen the official realists within these parties who say we must ally with the center-left, etc. And it also will depend on how the left within these new parties organize. And I think that, for me, reflecting on this, one of the problems, the way that the lefts have organized within these parties, is primarily in terms of winning on formal program and winning leadership positions within these parties. And I think while those things are important, they are necessary, they are insufficient. What is much more important is reviving what in the essay I call the rational core of Leninism, which is the attempt to transcend the division of labor between parties, on the one hand, which are electoral formations, and unions and social movements, through the organization of radical anti-capitalist activists to pose an alternative in practical struggles in organization to the forces of official reform. And ultimately, will this militant minority transform these parties contesting the direction of all struggles, both electoral and non-electoral, or will the party union officialdom maintain the division between politics defined narrowly as elections and economic or social struggles, strikes, social movements, etc.? Thank you.
Terrific. We actually now have 20 minutes for discussion, for questions. So I'll start up a list of comrades from the floor. Just to reiterate, please keep them short. If you have criticisms, try to be polite.